buzzing. Let's get into it. What's up, everybody? AJ LaMaestro back with you on Chicago Bears Hub. And before anything else, subscribe button right now if you haven't already. All right, a lot to cover today, so let's not waste a second. Let's start with the stadium situation again, because there's a new wrinkle worth mentioning, and I want to be careful here about what's confirmed fact versus what's educated speculation. The soil sampling work that began near Wolf Lake in late June typically takes a couple to a few weeks to fully process and evaluate. That means, by simple math, the Bears likely have those results in hand by now. Now, here's where I have to be honest with you. We do not have official confirmation of what those results actually say. What we do know is that we haven't seen any renewed public push or fresh conversation coming out of Arlington Heights, and we haven't seen Illinois officials publicly claiming the Bears reached back out, saying Indiana fell through. In my own personal opinions, the absence of that kind of pushback is at least suggestive that things are trending toward Hammond rather than away from it. But I want to stress that this is genuinely reading between the lines, not a confirmed report. And I'd encourage you to treat it exactly that way until we get something more concrete from the team or from Illinois lawmakers directly. Quick shout out while we're on housekeeping. If you're trying to keep track of who's actually on this 90-plus man training camp roster, there are some solid independent roster reference guides floating around social media right now that break down who wears what number, which is genuinely useful once you start hearing names you don't recognize called out in practice reports. Worth a follow if you want to keep up with the deep roster, guys. Okay, now let's get into the meat of today's show, because Caleb Williams has been doing the media rounds, and one stop was a sit down with Kay Adams where he talked about a number of things, including his receiver room. And as you heard in that opening clip, Caleb didn't come out and explicitly crown Luther Burden as his official wide receiver one. But the way he talked about him, that instinctive, make people miss, creates something out of nothing quality, that's exactly the kind of praise that gets a fan base fired up. And speaking of fired up, there's actually a real debate raging on social media right now about who this team's true number one receiver is. A recent fan poll had it sitting at roughly 57% for Luther Burden versus 42% for Rome Odunze. In my own personal opinions, I think that's a fascinating snapshot of where this fan base's head is at. But I also think it might be a little unfair to Rome, and here's why. Before his injury last season, Rome Odunze was actually leading the entire NFL in touchdown receptions, leading the league. That's not some minor accomplishment that should get buried under one off season of hype for a younger teammate. And on the subject of that injury, Rome has continued to be direct and clear about where he stands physically. Ben Johnson himself has stated there's no difference in the way Rome is running, and Rome's own words on it were essentially that there's no functional difference in his movement. He just knows the injury happened, which is a completely normal thing for any player to carry mentally after breaking a bone. In my own personal opinions, that's about as reassuring a statement as you could ask for from both the player and the head coach. And honestly, I think the healthiest way to look at this receiver room isn't picking a strict 1 and 2. I think you've got two legitimate number one caliber receivers, and whichever one is technically listed as WR2 on a given week is still going to be heavily featured in this offense. That is an incredible problem for a team to have, and in my own personal opinions, Bears fans should just be soaking this up rather than fighting about labels. Let's shift to the defensive line, because Austin Booker has reportedly added some real visible muscle this offseason, and there's a genuinely interesting storyline buried in that detail. Booker is entering a season where a lot of people around this team believe he's on the verge of a true breakout, and the only real variable left, in my own personal opinions, is simply reps and time on the field to let it all come together. Looking across the projected front of this defensive line, Montez Sweat, Gervon Dexter, Grady Jarrett, and Booker himself in that rotation, there's real legitimate upside there. Now, I want to be balanced about this, because last season, this defense actually got worse against the run for a stretch after some of these rotational pieces shifted. And in my own personal opinions, I don't think that was purely a personnel talent issue. I think losing Grady Jarrett to injury for a chunk of the season and leaning on a less effective nose tackle in his place had a real measurable impact on the run defense that sometimes gets unfairly pinned on the edge rushers instead. If this front stays healthy this year, I genuinely believe the run stopping numbers improve significantly. And it's not just the line, the linebacker core has real reason for optimism too, assuming health cooperates. Devin Bush and TJ Edwards project as close to every down players in the scheme. And in my own personal opinions, if this group stays on the field together consistently, which wasn't always the case last season with injuries, in that room, this defense's ability to actually stop the run at the second level should take a real step forward. Now, let's talk trenches on the other side of the ball because Darnell Wright deserves way more shine than he's getting right now. Some analysts have floated him as this team's legitimate non-quarterback MVP candidate heading into a potential breakout season, even with Pro Football Focus ranking him only around the middle of the pack among right tackles league-wide last year. In my own personal opinions, that ranking undersells him, and more importantly, rankings don't win football games, performance does. And here's a storyline worth tracking closely all offseason. Reports indicate the Bears are working on a contract extension for Wright that could put him among the highest paid right tackles in football. And there's similar work reportedly happening on a long-term deal for Caleb Williams himself. In my own personal opinions, I don't think Caleb is the kind of player who's looking to reset the entire quarterback market just to say he did it. I think this is a guy who cares more about winning and legacy than being the single highest paid passer in the league. And I'd expect him to land comfortably among the top 5 quarterback salaries without necessarily topping the chart, which frankly says a lot about his priorities as a competitor. Let's run through the receiver room one more time with an eye toward who actually makes this 53-man roster because training camp is officially underway, and this is when those decisions really start taking shape. Rome Odunze and Luther Burden are obviously locks. Jalen Walker has carried himself well enough this offseason that he looks like a strong bet for that third spot. Caleb Raymond came in specifically to challenge for meaningful snaps, whether that ends up being the clear number 3 or 4 role. And Xavier Thomas, who we've already talked about at length, looks like a real threat to make this roster given his explosiveness, even though it's worth remembering that flashing without pads on is a different challenge than flashing once real contact begins. Beyond that group veteran depth piece, Scotty Miller, with nearly 100 career receptions over 7 seasons, looks like a sensible bet if this team decides to carry 6 receivers again like they did a year ago. Now, let's talk about a name that's suddenly relevant to this team's defensive line conversation. Vita Vea. This is real confirmed news, not speculation. The veteran Buccaneers defensive tackle formally requested a trade after contract extension talks with Tampa Bay stalled out, and he's entering the final year of his current deal. Now, I want to be straight with you about where the reported interest actually points, because I don't want to feed you a rumor that isn't grounded in anything real. Reporting has linked Vea's own preference toward teams like the Raiders or a California-based club, not specifically Chicago. So while it's completely fair for Bears fans to daydream about what a player of his caliber could do plugged into this front, in my own personal opinions, I don't think Chicago is currently sitting at the top of the list of realistic landing spots based on what's actually being reported. That said, if the Bears front office wanted to make a call and see what the asking price looks like, I don't think it would hurt to check in, especially given the questions this team still has at that interior spot with Grady Jarrett getting up there in age. All right, Bears Nation, before we get back into the lighter football talk, I need to take a moment and I want to ask you to sit with me here because this next part isn't going to have any jokes in it, and it shouldn't. This week, we learned that the wife of Eric Bieniemy, who spent last season as this team's running backs coach before returning to Kansas City as their offensive coordinator, was shot at the family's home in Virginia, and that their adult son was arrested and charged in connection with the shooting. Reporting has confirmed she is out of the ICU and improving, which is genuinely the most important piece of news in all of this. I'm not going to speculate about what happened inside that home because none of us actually know. And honestly, in my own personal opinions, it isn't my place or this show's place to turn a family's private painful crisis into content for entertainment. Eric Bieniemy spent real time in this building, coaching players on this roster, and whatever complicated, difficult thing his family is walking through right now deserves our respect, not our commentary. So I'm just going to say this plainly. I hope Mia Bieniemy continues to heal. I hope this family finds whatever support and peace they need to get through something this hard. And I think the most useful thing any of us watching from the outside can do is simply hold that hope for them and move on with basic human decency. That's all I've got to say about it. All right, let's bring this episode home because we covered a genuinely full slate today. The Hammond, Indiana Stadium situation continuing to lean in one direction without official confirmation either way. Caleb Williams gushing about Luther Burden while Rome Odunze quietly reminds everybody he led the league in touchdowns before his injury. A defensive front with real breakout potential if health cooperates. Darnell Wright quietly building a case as this roster's most underrated piece heading into a contract year. The receiver room taking real shape as camp roster decisions loom. And a Vita Vea trade saga that's fascinating around the league, even if Chicago isn't the obvious landing spot right now. So here's what I need from you to close things out. Smash that like button if you're fired up about where this roster is trending. Drop your vote in the comments. Rome or Luther, or are you with me on calling it a genuine tie at the top of this receiver room? And as always, if you have not subscribed yet, please help us keep pushing toward 4,000 because this channel only grows because all of you keep showing up. Subscribe to Chicago Bears Hub for more no-filter Bears coverage, and take care of each other out there. This is AJ LaMaestro. Bear down.